Welcome everyone to the second half of Professor Erik Levi's lecture, brought to you from Guildford by the Guildford Twinning Association. In part one, we looked at Beethoven's place in musical history and tradition, how he changed the nature of most musical genres, and pioneered the duo sonata for piano and cello. In this second part, Erik's going to take us through Beethoven's great personal crisis, showing us its transformational effect on his musical development. He and his cellist wife Jo will give us some insights into the musical riches of three more cello sonatas. We have a treat in store for you.
In part two, we're going to look at Beethoven's middle and late periods and the transformation of his musical language. We have to remember that despite the radical nature of the cello sonatas, Beethoven enjoyed great success in Vienna up to the end of the 18th century. The big crisis point in his life came when he discovered that he was losing his hearing. This had a devastating impact on his well-being and his morale. In fact, 1802 was probably the darkest year of his life. It was that year that he drafted the famous Heiligenstadt Testament, which he drafted to the rest of his family, which was only discovered after his death. It was a confessional document regarding ever-increasing fears for his deafness and well-being, and particularly the fears about him having to isolate himself from society. Just to give you an idea of the desperate nature of this document, I'm going to quote a couple of lines. "Now that for 6 years I have been a hopeless case, aggravated by senseless physicians, cheated year after year in the hope of improvement, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady, whose cure will take years and perhaps be impossible, born with an ardent and lively temperament, even susceptible to the diversions of society. I was compelled early to isolate myself, to live in loneliness, when I at times tried to forget others." In fact, Beethoven was so desperate that he even contemplated suicide. He felt that devoting himself exclusively to composition would be his only salvation. Again, a quote from the Heiligenstadt Testament, I quote, "I was brought to the verge of despair, but little more and I would have been put, I was brought to the verge of despair, but little more and I would have put an end to my life. Only art it was that withheld me. It seemed impossible to leave the world until I had produced all that I felt called upon for me to produce. I hope my determination will remain firm." So, the crisis in Beethoven's personal life changed his music forever. And how did this come about? He became far more of an individualist in his approach. He was less concerned with entertaining listeners and his patrons, and he was more concerned with stamping his own individuality on things, transforming those classical genres that he had inherited from Mozart and Haydn. And he was, in this period, developing an increasingly romantic language with emotional and dramatic themes. On the one hand, he expanded the scale and scope of his music with much longer works like the Eroica Symphony and the Razumovsky Quartet. But at the same time, this is why we can't make generalizations, there are also very compressed works which are also radical in this sense. There's a kind of unpredictable development in this period. So, how did these developments impinge upon the middle period A major cello sonata, which was composed in 1809? Well, first of all, let's look at the title page of the Opus 69 sonata. First of all, you'll notice that it's designated a grand sonata pour pianoforte et violoncelle, not pianoforte with cello. So already there's a change. The actual notion being piano, although stated first, is the equal of the cello. The balance is changed. Of course, Beethoven's name is a much bigger typeface than in the early sonata because, of course, Beethoven is a much better known composer. The dedication of the sonata was to Baron Ignaz von Liechtenstein, a wealthy patron and devoted cellist. The first performance, however, was not given by the patron, but by Beethoven with a professional cellist, Nikolaus Kraft, the best-known cello virtuoso in Vienna. And a review of the work appearing in a specialist musical journal of the time gives us a good idea about the character of the work and how it was received by contemporary audiences at that time. I quote again. The whole piece is beautifully rounded, full of lovely tenderness, as few others are. This is the important sentence. It is at once truly romantic and drawn from the genuine depth of soul. When dispatched by two players, whereby, to be sure, accomplished fingers and masterful bow are not in themselves sufficient, one can expect the most splendid effect. Now, what are the features of the Opus 69 sonata that are typical of middle period Beethoven? Well, the first characteristic of this sonata, at least in the first movement, is how lyrical it is. We had some glimpses of that in the Opus 5 sonatas, but lyricism becomes much more prevalent. And whereas in the Opus 5 sonatas we had short fragments of ideas, here Beethoven indulges in long, brief melodies. There are still the same stark contrast in mood and character, which we hope to illustrate in a moment. But perhaps more interestingly, there's much greater equality between the instruments. And the radical difference, I think, here is very much in the cello part. Whereas in the early sonatas, Beethoven was feeling his way with the cello thanks to the help of Dupont. In this particular work, the cello is employed in all its registers. It can be a bass instrument, supplying the bass line, while the piano has the main material. It can be an alto voice, so it has its kind of mellow sound. It can also be a soprano, showing its real versatility. And the piano part is carefully balanced to cope better with the most powerful and less penetrating register in the cello. So, whereas in the first sonatas, the piano part is quite heavily orchestrated, full of texture. In this work, you'll notice a thinning of the texture. Now, we heard extended music examples of the first two cello sonatas, but instead, we'd like to play focus on four different musical ideas that make up the exposition or first part of the Opus 69 first movement. These four ideas will be played separately, but I want to emphasize here that they unfold seamlessly into each other. And the other striking factor about these four ideas is that they are vastly contrasted in character, showing us how far Beethoven has travelled from his early works. The first idea is extremely lyrical, and it's significant here that rather than you would expect both instruments to start, as in the first two sonatas, it's the cello that opens with an unaccompanied melody. And the piano creeps in almost unobtrusively, adding a brilliant cadenza and a fast descending run of chords. Then, in kind of democratic fashion, the whole process is repeated, this time with the piano giving us the melody, and the cello responding with its own cadenza. So this is the opening of the A major cello. The second idea, which follows immediately, is completely different. It's aggressive and stormy in character, and it's cast in the dark minor. So here's the second. This leads into the third idea, a gentle cello melody that encompasses the entire register of the instrument, climbing to the cello's highest regions. As in the first example, this material is shared out democratically, and that the piano then takes up the scale passage. So this is the third example. The fourth idea marks another contrast. This is much more heroic music, initially punctuated by plucking notes from the cello and brilliant fast flourishes from the piano. And this is the fourth example. So it's remarkable in many ways how Beethoven manages to weld those very different, disparate ideas into a convincing whole. I'm sorry that we don't have time today to hear the four ideas joined together. However, before we leave this first movement, there's one further remarkable aspect of the movement that is well worth discussion. This occurs in the middle section of the movement, the development section. Traditionally, the development section expanded, transformed material already heard in the exposition. So in other words, you hear one of those ideas or two of those ideas kind of developed. But Beethoven dispensed with this convention. He'd already done so in the Heroic Symphony, where he introduced a completely new melodic idea in the middle of the movement, nothing related to anything that had gone before. And because this idea is kind of rather sinister, it casts a dark shadow over the whole movement. And he repeats this tactic in this cello sonata. There's an unexpected change of mood to a much darker minor key. And perhaps this explains something that puzzled scholars and people who've analysed this composition since Beethoven's death. When they discovered the manuscript, the autographed manuscript in the Baron's possession, it had the words, "This work was composed inter lacrimas et luctum," between tears and grief. What does this mean? The music you heard thus far doesn't sound, it may sound stormy, but it doesn't sound as if it's burdened with tears and grief. The explanation perhaps comes in this central section. Because the new melody that Beethoven uses here is not actually his own, it's a direct quote from something else. It's a quote from the aria Es ist vollbracht from Bach's St. John Passion. This is a poignant aria that appears near the end of the work, depicting Jesus Christ's last moments on earth. It's also remarkable because it has a solo for the viola da gamba, the prototype or the early example of the cello. So let's now hear the Bach in its original with the cello solo, and we will follow that with the Beethoven. Okay, I hope you'll be able to hear the connection between the two works when we play the Beethoven. Of course, the Beethoven is very different in the way it uses the melody. It starts quite lyrically, but then unleashes a violent storm before eventually calming down. So this is the opening of the development section of this new Bach thing. I hope you hear the connection between the two. I think it's quite unmistakable. Inevitably, this darker, more troubled music casts a shadow over the rest of the movement, and also this sense of unease spills over into the second one, which is a nervy dance or scherzo, which creates a kind of destabilising influence on the listener because of the way that Beethoven plays with our expectations. The rhythms displaced by syncopated accents. It's a kind of very modernist approach, approaching 20th century music. So this is where you could call this innovative music. So this is the opening of the second one. This tension between music that gropes towards an uncertain future and looks back reflectively to the past becomes more intensified in Beethoven's last period. This late period began around 1815, one of its first fruits being the two late sonatas. So, as before, let's look at the title page of the Opus 102 sonatas. Beethoven's name appears in bigger letters than in the earlier sonatas because, of course, it's even more well known. Significantly, no dedication appears on the title page, so the idea of flattering a patron is no longer necessary. I think it's also revealing that the publisher of the music, housed in Bonn and Cologne, has an arrangement with the British publisher. This already signifies how much wider the dissemination of Beethoven music has been at this time. Let's look at their personal and textual background to these sonatas. We talked about a crisis point in 1802 with Beethoven's realization that he was undergoing health problems with his deafness. But perhaps this period of his life was even more difficult, because by then Beethoven's health had deteriorated so much and his deafness had increased that he was no longer able to function as a performer of his own music. So he became increasingly more isolated from society. He had to communicate with people, he had to write questions and respond by writing the responses. And of course, also, he was desperate because of his love life. His love life was basically non-existent. And the discovery after his death of a desperate letter to the so-called immortal beloved reconciled Beethoven to accepting that he could no longer lead a normal life and settle with the woman of his dreams. This personal crisis also affected the quality of his compositions. For the first time in his life, he entered the fallow period, producing few works of lasting artistic value. I already mentioned the Wellington Victory, which is an occasional one. It's very popular, but it's not a work that shows Beethoven being terribly inventive. And there was another occasional work, the Cantata der glorreiche Augenblick, the glorious moment, composed for the Congress of Vienna, which also is not a worthy companion to some of the other works he composed at that time. In fact, a lot of this period was devoted to tinkering with earlier works. He, in 1814, devoted almost the whole year to revising his earlier opera, which was originally called Leonora and is now, of course, known as Fidelio. He really was in a crisis, and he overcame this crisis the following year by producing the cello sonatas in a new, more elusive style. And again, it's worth looking at contemporary reviews because they tell us quite a lot about how this new style was received. He didn't say that it was a new style, but it was clearly evident to listeners who had been fed on his earlier music. This change of style was immediately recognised by listeners and reviewers, and a comment from a journal that was published in 1818 is quite interesting. These two sonatas are surely amongst the most remarkable and strange works written in a long time. The emphasis on strange is interesting. Everything here is different, very different from what we've received up to now, even from this master. If we try to provide those who do not yet know these sonatas a rough idea of the type and style in which they were created, we would say, remember the instrumental works of Sebastian Bach. Add in this respect the tastes of our time, and furnish yourself with what is left. Instead of the readily accessible, the multifarious fantastic containing all the inner unity of the new great master. Everything merely brilliant, even more so, everything that is only delightful and satiating the ears is rejected. Again, Beethoven seems to be renouncing technical virtuosity for its own sake in favour of working the music out in a more abstract manner. To some degree, even its technical coherence becomes evident only gradually to the player or listeners, since the melody is often rough and the harmony is sometimes harsh. So, this quote is picking on two things. First of all, the reference to music of the past, redundant music in the eyes of contemporaries, but not for Beethoven. And also in the fact that it's strange and unexpected. It's not concerned with display and satisfying the listener with sweet harmonies. So how are these works different? Well, we talked about juxtapositions in the other early and middle period sonatas, but here the juxtapositions are much more abrupt, and they occur at all levels of the music: structure, the work, movements, thematic material, motives, characteristic gestures, registers and sonorities. And whereas in the A major sonata we have an expansive concept of musical development, here everything is compressed in a manner that's unrelated to earlier Beethoven. Some scholars have referred to this as a lyric density of ideas because it's connected to a certain extent to Beethoven's ongoing struggle to revise his opera Fidelio the previous year. So the reference to the old, in particular Baroque music, and to the new becomes a central theme of this work and, of course, my lecture. So let's end by looking at the influence of earlier music on the Opus 102 sonatas and follow that by looking at the new Opus 102. As Beethoven became more isolated, cut off from society, he increasingly turned inwards, and he became more and more fascinated by the music of the old masters. He particularly admired Bach and Handel, and two statements related to these composers perhaps give us an idea of how he revered these great masters of the past. And remember, by this stage, the 1820s, such music was very much out of fashion. He said of Bach, his name ought not to be Bach, which of course is German for brook, but ocean, because of his infinite and inexhaustible wealth of tonal combinations of harmonies. He was even more effusive about Handel, who said in 1823, Handel was the greatest composer that ever lived. I would uncover my head and kneel before his grave in his honour. So, let's end by exploring the tensions between the old and the new in these Opus 102 sonatas. Three music examples illustrate the influence of early music. First, let's hear the opening of the cello sonata in C major, the first of the two Opus 102 sonatas. Like the A major sonata, it opens with a single unaccompanied melodic line in the cello, which is then imitated in the left hand of the piano. But the kind of writing here is very different. Whereas in the Beethoven it's melodic, here it's what we call linear, in the sense that the two lines interweave. And this simple idea, although it's only 2 bars long, actually provides all the material for the rest of the work. So let's hear now the slow introduction to the C major sonata. So that was the slow introduction to the C major sonata. Now we're going to hear two different examples from the D major sonata, the second of the two Opus 102 sonatas. We're going to hear the opening of the slow movement, which is a dark and austere chorale. We know chorales were a familiar musical device in Bach's passions and cantatas. And if we just hear this music example on its own, it sounds as if it invokes early music. The second example from the D major sonatas is from the finale. This is rather unusual, unique in fact in Beethoven's cello sonatas. It's actually a fugue, again a reference to an early Baroque genre. A fugue is a contrapuntal composition perfected by Bach in which a short melody or phrase is introduced by one part, successively taken over by other parts, and then intensively developed, intervening with various parts. This device of a fugue becomes a familiar or increasingly familiar musical gesture in Beethoven's later music. You can find many examples in later works, such as the finale of the Ninth Symphony, the finale of the Hammerklavier Sonata, and perhaps most famously in the Grosse Fuge, or large fugue for string quartet. So this is the opening of this fugal idea. Very different from anything we've heard in Beethoven. finally look at the new in the Opus 102 sonatas. The C major sonata, which we heard just now prior to the D major sonata, is unlike anything else in Beethoven's output of dual sonatas. Its structure is so unconventional that it's difficult to analyse it. It's actually an unbroken sequence of 5 different sections and sounds almost like an improvisation. The D major sonata, in contrast, is much more traditional. It follows the fast, slow, fast structure that we mentioned at the beginning. But now let's return to some music we've heard before, the slow movement. We heard the chorale at the beginning. It starts, as I say, in an austere manner, evoking the crest. But what follows it immediately afterwards is quite unexpected and far more personal. I think of it as an explosion of grief and suffering. It's overwhelmingly poignant music. Perhaps it was influenced to a certain extent by Beethoven's experience of writing and revising Fidelio. And in fact, operatic music, or notions of operatic music, become more of a recurring pattern in Beethoven's last works. Here it's heard for the first time in the slow movement. Our final music example comes from the first movement of the D major sonata. Far more compressed in design than earlier first movements. You heard the A major, you heard all 5 different thematic materials that go into the first movement of the A major. This is a much shorter and compressed concept. And the juxtaposition of different melodic ideas is indeed more abrupt, whereas the A major sonata has a smooth kind of transition. Even though the ideas are very different, it's smoothly conceived. This is much more abrupt and strange. I think the references to the new come in the fascinating references to the external world in which Beethoven lived. You have to remember this was composed during the time of the French occupation of Vienna. And obviously, the constant bombardment of Vienna couldn't help but have a profound impact on Beethoven's mental stability. He often sought refuge in basements to shield him from the awful noise. And in fact, in this music, not only do we get militaristic gestures, but we also get the kind of stormy left-hand notes, which suggest to me gunfire. And there's a kind of uncertainty, unsettled nature about the music, which continually veering from one mood to another, which creates this kind of destabilizing effect. So this is very much new the new arrangement. So this is our last music example from the opening of the D major sonata. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Erik Levi and Jo Levi, for the amazing insights you brought us. I myself will now be a much more informed listener to these works, which will enhance my enjoyment enormously, and I'm really grateful. It's been an honour and a privilege to hear you. Now, if you too enjoyed the lecture and feel you've learned something, do please support the Guildford Twinning Association's work to increase international friendship and collaboration. Do make a donation. You can do it online. Go to our website at guildfordtwinning.uk. Thank you.